It is March 5th, 2016. My name is Amanda Nagel. I am here with Joe Morse to talk about his time in the Civil Rights Movement. I have had the pleasure of being able to work with both Tomas Tavaisis and John Campbell from the Winona State University History Department to compile questions to ask Joe. We'll talk a little bit about your background first. Can you please state for the record your full name, date and location of birth, where you grew up, your size of your family, and your education?
My name is Joe Morse. I was born in Duluth, Minnesota, 1943. St. Mary's Hospital, same hospital Bob Dylan was born in a year before.
Really?
Yeah. My mother lived there. My father was in the Navy. And we moved to southeast Minnesota near Winona here in 1948, and there was already 3 children, and eventually our family became 7 children. And we had a apple orchard that our family ran in Dakota, and that was family business, and that's where I spent all of my time from the time I was 6 or 7 years old till I left home to go to the Civil Rights Movement. I spent a lot of it in that orchard. So I went to elementary and high school, elementary, grade school, high school, and college in Catholic schools, Cotter High School in Winona and St. Mary's University here in Winona. I left St. Mary's as a junior.
Can you now discuss a little bit of the influence of your upbringing, education, and other factors that shaped your interest in not only the Civil Rights Movement, but just also in community activism?
Well, my family was very, very active in the Catholic Church. We went to church regularly and participated in all the activities, and I was an altar boy, and I helped mow the cemetery lawn in the community. But our family was known for being very involved in the church and in the community, doing things to make it a better place. And I think my folks drummed into me that was important for everybody to participate in making the community better. It goes back a long ways. My grandfather in the Twin Cities was a mayor, and he was very active in the community in Minneapolis. It was a family thing that you were supposed to get involved in the community and make it better. That's the way we all grew up. And I think one of the things that began to shape my interest in civil rights was in high school. I read the book Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin, and made me realize that there was some serious discrimination going on in our country. And since that time, I think it was junior in high school, I started reading more information, books and magazines and newsletters, things that weren't readily available. I'd write for newsletters and just kind of keep up on things. And actually, when I was at St. Mary's University, I was in the seminary for 2 years, a St. Mary, Immaculate Heart of Mary Seminary, studying to be a parish priest. In my junior year, I was president of the Mission Club, and typically the Mission Club was to raise money for sending to places overseas like India to help poor people. And I switched that around, and I said, since we had so much poverty and discrimination in our country, we should be raising money for African American people in the South. And that actually created some conflict within the seminary, because that wasn't kind of how the Catholic Church was engaged at all with domestic poverty. I had a little struggle with people in the seminary about that, which was kind of interesting way to begin organizing around civil rights within, my seminary. I think all of those factors really helped shape, what my experience was. And then as I became more and more aware of what was happening in the South through the SNCC newsletter, the Student Voice, I just became quite aware that it's something I really wanted to get involved in somehow.
Well, and now was that activism in the seminary that you were, as a junior, focused on getting all of that funding and trying to help in the South? Was that before or after your first visit to the South?
That was actually before that. Yeah. When I first really became aware of the problems and the discrimination in the South was when I took this trip in the summer of 1963. I just decided I wanted to go south and see what it was like, and I wasn't affiliated with any organization. I had family friends who did a lot of hitchhiking, and it was something people did a lot then, and so I just talked to my folks about it, and I had some relatives in Biloxi, Mississippi. And so the plan was I was going to visit them and hitchhike down to Mississippi and then hitchhike back. And of course my real reason was to really see what was it like in the South, having read the book Black Like Me. So I really did realize how much segregation there was with the lunch counters being separated. Didn't see any blacks in the lunch counters, saw the black and white fountains. So I sought out the waiting rooms in the bus stations to see where the black waiting room was. Usually the whites don't really see that black waiting room. It's off to the side and it's not visible unless you're looking for it. And so I kind of poked around and saw some of the discrimination, saw some of the segregation. But I didn't really engage much with white folks or black folks. I was just kind of taking a summer trip. It lasted about 2 weeks, and visited my folks and my relatives in Biloxi, and then came back. But it was really it really brought home what segregation was like and how poor black folks were in the South, and how you never saw black people in positions of any kind of leadership or any kind of significant role. And it just made it more clear to me.
Between the seminary, your trip to the South, and reading Black Like Me, all of these things combined with reading the SNCC newsletters, how would you describe that as impacting you and influencing you to join the civil rights movement?
Well, I didn't really have any idea how I could join the civil rights movement, and I just was very interested in it and thought, this is something I really wanted to know more about. I wasn't sure I wanted to be involved. And then in the fall of 1963, we had a local demonstration here in Winona. There was a civil rights worker from Minneapolis who was incarcerated in Americus, Georgia he was desegregating lunch counters, and he was charged with insurrection, put in jail, and insurrection in Georgia was a capital crime. So there was massive demonstrations throughout the United States to get him and the other folks out of jail. So that was my first demonstration here. There's a St. Mary's University newsletter here where shows me with a group of people demonstrating right next to the post office in Winona. So that was my first demonstration right here in Winona. And it was led by my sociology professor, who I liked a lot, Clyde Kendrick, who was a big inspiration to me and a mentor. So I started to get more involved, kind of locally. And then, of course, there was the March on Washington in August of 1963, and that had a big impact on me. 200,000 plus black and white people marching for jobs and for freedom. And I saw that and realized that white people were really getting involved in this movement. And so I just, and then John Kennedy was murdered, or assassinated in November, and his inaugural speech, his famous speech, think not what your country can do for you, but think what you can do for your country, was kind of resonating throughout the communities, throughout the country. Then there was a 16th Street Baptist Church, which was the KKK's response to the March on Washington in September of '63. So all of this just really made me feel like I needed to do something, especially the bombing of the church, because there was those 3 or 4 little girls in the basement of the church getting ready for Sunday school. I was in the seminary. I was studying to be a priest, and this just really tore my heart out. And as I've talked to other civil rights workers, that incident of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was probably one of the more influential incidents that caused a lot of the volunteers to think that they needed to step up and get involved.
How did you first hear about Freedom Summer, and what was the application process itself like?
I first heard about Freedom Summer in that SNCC newsletter. It says support SNCC today, and on the side of it, it said Mississippi Summer Project was set. At the very bottom of it, it talks about the Civil Rights Project, the Summer Project. John Lewis was quoted that we needed people to help out. And at the bottom, it just said if you wanted to apply, write for an application in Jackson. So I did. I just wrote for the application and got it back, filled it out. It was fairly extensive, 2-3 pages long, and submitted it. And within a few weeks, I think that was in March of '64, I got a letter back saying they're interested in having me participate. I had no idea what the criteria was or how they were judging me. I'm sure I mentioned that I'd already been in a demonstration, locally and supporting a SNCC organizer, and I'd been involved with, in the seminary, and I probably told them about my mission club work, trying to raise money for poor people in the South, and I must have impressed them. I don't know, but I was happy to get invited. Well,
that's great. Can you talk a little bit about when, where, and how you prepared to take on this project, going and being a part of Freedom Summer?
There was a number of memos that was sent to me and all to all the volunteers. I think this one is early May, and we received them throughout May and into June. Applicants that were accepted, they asked us to read 5 books: Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Mind of the South, W.J. Cash, The Other America by Michael Harrington, Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King, and Killers of the Dream by Lillian Smith. So I received this in May, and there was a lot of reading to do. They wanted to really prepare us for what the South was like, not just African-American South, but the white South and how it functioned. And then there was several other memos after that talked about what was happening, some of the things that were currently a problem in Mississippi. They were asking for money constantly. So it was kind of a communication going back and forth, but I never actually physically talked with anybody. Just received these memos and read them, and then they told me I actually had to go to summer school, so I couldn't go to the June training for Freedom Summer in Oxford, Ohio, but had to leave after July 4th and went to Lemoyne College in Memphis for my training. It was for people who weren't able to be at the Ohio training.
So how long was the training in Memphis?
Well, it was a week. I think the one in Oxford, Ohio, might have been 10 days or so. So this was a little bit more compressed, but it was really, really a good training. They provided a lot of information. One of the things that I think was most important for me was that they talked, for instance, about what we would expect to hear from African American folk, black folk in the community, how they would treat us, why we would not be trusted as white people, and the fact that we would be called yes sir and yes ma'am, and that's just the way black people talk to white people because they were afraid of talking any other way. Taught us all about that. Taught about us, nonviolent direct action, hassle lines, how you prepare yourself emotionally and physically for possibly getting attacked, knowing how to crawl, get down on the ground in a ball to protect your vitals, and then the whole idea of having a hassle line where we'd have 2 groups, one the demonstrators and one the people on the side, beating you with newspapers and beating you with small sticks just to get the feel of what it was like, and then to talk about that. How did you feel about it? What was it emotionally like for you? So that you had the opportunity to really process the feelings that you would have, not just how you're going to physically protect yourself, but the feelings that you might have, and then a lot of discussion about that. One of the things that we reviewed and talked a lot about was nonviolent direct action. I remember having read the letter from Birmingham jail by Dr. King. He wrote in 1963, and it talked about creative tension, why it's important to have direct action. It creates tension, it creates conflict, but it's nonviolent. It's bringing the issue to the surface, so you can't ignore it anymore. And a lot of discussion about that, and then information, for instance, about lynching. I mean, for instance, I really didn't know about lynching, and they showed us, photos of lynching, things that pictures people had taken. It shows mobs, laughing and smiling and pointing to the corpse on the ground, or pointing to, the guy hanging from the tree, and made the point to us that every black person in the South either had family members or friends or relatives who knew somebody who had been lynched, and it was just something that black people lived with. And so they tried to help us understand that black people had been terrorized for many years, and were really afraid of white people, and they would be afraid of us even though we're there to help. I think also then we began to learn about freedom songs. They taught us about taught us the freedom songs, encouraged us to sing them a lot in the training, encouraged us to go learn more of them. So it was a good training.
But how did it prepare you to work in Mississippi specifically, and in Meridian? Okay,
so my job was going to be voter registration, so they showed us the forms that people had to fill out to register to vote. They talked to us about how the registrars would refuse to allow black people to vote because in Mississippi you had to interpret a section of the Mississippi Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar, which was completely subjective. So we knew, and we'd studied the forms. We knew, for instance, they taught us how to write affidavits when we'd had an incident, when there was some kind of, violence or some kind of, demonstration or some kind of discrimination, how to prepare an affidavit, write it, what kind of forms to use. A lot of what the volunteers were in Freedom Summer for was to be able to do this paperwork, to be able to keep track of what was going on, and making sure that things were done properly according to the law, because we weren't the local people who were going to really do the organizing. We were there just kind of as technical people, more or less, So that was our role, and that was made very clear. The other thing that was made really clear to us is that if we wanted to be in the movement in the South, we had to be prepared to accept the leadership of the local people. And they told us flat out, if you can't do that, then go home. We don't need you. We just need you to understand that you're there as a helper. You're not there to make decisions about what goes on. You're there to do your job and not to try to overshadow the local people, because they're the ones that have to live there. They're going to live in that community and do, have the effects of whatever movement work is done. And you're going to be gone. And so you can't force or encourage black people to take risks that they don't want to take.
Along those same lines, before you left Winona, for your training even, three Freedom Summer workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were killed by a local white KKK mob. How did you find out about their disappearance?
Well, actually, I just found out about it on the news. Watching the news one evening, and they came on that these three civil rights workers had disappeared, and it wasn't clear what happened to them. And not knowing them, I was still in school, in summer school. I was here in Winona when I heard about it, and so it was shocking. It was kind of frightening. It made me realize that this might be what I'd face if I went to the South. And so I talked it over with my folks and with friends, and realized that, having read what I read about what was happening in the South with the bombings and shootings and burnings, that this wasn't that unusual. This wasn't something that was a complete surprise, but it was shocking to me. And I didn't really know that much about Mississippi, so I didn't know where it had happened. I didn't know it was in Neshoba County. I didn't know it was in Meridian. I just knew it had happened in Mississippi. So it was kind of a frightening thing, but it didn't deter me. I mean, I really felt like, this is something I was going to do, and this is what I knew was likely to happen to some people, and still going to go.
Did it almost steal your resolve to go and make sure that you would take part in this?
Yeah, it was like, this was a movement for justice. It's a movement for equality, and sometimes people die I mean, that's the reality because the opposition is so strong.
When you found out this news and the disappearance on the news and all of that, was your first instinct that most likely they were already dead? Or were you thinking that maybe there was still a chance that they were still alive?
So being in Winona still and not part of the movement, I really didn't know. I mean, you know, you were getting these news broadcasts that they didn't know where they were, and, you know, maybe they were still alive and maybe they were dead. People in the movement knew they were dead right away, but I didn't because I wasn't there yet. I hadn't really learned about how things work, you know. But as soon as I got to Meridian, you know, in mid-July, or July 10th was the day I arrived there, I got informed real quick. Actually, in the training, it was real clear. Everybody knew that they were dead already. Everybody knew that they weren't hiding out. So the newspapers were talking about, oh, maybe they went on vacation to Cuba, or maybe they went back to New York for a vacation, or, you know, maybe they were, I don't know. There's all kind of stories about maybe what happened to them. Especially in the South, you'd hear this, not so much up here.
Can you talk a little bit more, again, about the training, about bonding, and because you're there for those 7 days, and pretty much all of you are thrown together so quickly, and knowing that some of you are going to end up in the same places, some of you are going to end up in different places, how did that lead to bonding among students who are headed south? So
there was a lot of talk about the 3 civil rights workers that had been missing and assumed murdered by this time. And so those in the training, we talked among ourselves, and we were encouraged by the trainers to kind of talk about how we felt about that and whether that would deter us and whether we were frightened by it. And so part of the training was to help you realize that you were part of a movement. Now we weren't doing this individually. You were part of a movement, and that what you thought and what you did you know, wasn't that important. It's what the overall impact of the movement was. So that kind of was drummed into us. You didn't function kind of individually, and I mean, I think in this country we think of people being kind of individualistic and doing their own thing, and that's precisely the kind of folks they wanted to weed out and not have them come down, those that felt like they had to make a splash for themselves, or those people who felt like they needed to somehow get their name in the paper or somehow get recognition. They talked to us about how you're part of a movement and everybody moves together. You move together and you work as a team and you work as groups together, and what you think, you can always offer your suggestions, but you're never supposed to move on it unless you get consensus from the group. And so they taught us about consensus decision making, for instance, which SNCC was really big on, and so was CORE, and how to make those decisions and how to do it in a respectful way. Disagreeing, arguing, having different opinions, but still being respectful.
Well, and how many then of the people that you trained with went to Meridian with you?
I'm not sure. There was a few. I'm not sure how big that training was, frankly, in Memphis. I think it might have been 40 or 50 people. It wasn't a big training. I think 2 or 3 at least of the folks went to Meridian with me.
Can you describe some of the specific goals and objectives, and specifically what issues in Meridian did COFO and CORE want to address in 1964?
So if we look at the big picture for Freedom Summer, the goal of the project was to bring students from around the country into Mississippi to help black people in their local communities organize voter registration, freedom schools, and community centers. So in addition to doing that work, the bigger, broader goal was to provide the rest of the country information about what was happening in Mississippi. Mississippi was considered a closed society. What was going on with the bombings and the burnings and the killings, they weren't reported locally in local Mississippi papers, and certainly then there was no national reporting outside of Mississippi. So all this information I'd been reading about in the student voice that SNCC had, it never went anywhere. Nobody knew about it. So the goal of the project was to have us come down, have some of these experiences, and then write back and inform our parents and our relatives and the people in the communities where we lived what was going on, and then that would in turn be a way for our families to influence the senators, the representatives, and the country as a whole. So part of our job was, and we learned this in the training, is that, as a matter of fact, before one of the pieces of the application was to write down any kind of contacts you had in the media, all right, before I went there, as part of the application. Because what they wanted to know what value was I going to be to the project, to the Freedom Summer, to inform the rest of the people in Minnesota, all right? So it was important that we understood that in some ways we were kind of just being used as a way to get information about Mississippi out. And of course, when those 3 civil rights workers were murdered, that was proof positive about what was going on. 2 Jews from New York City and 1 black man from Meridian were murdered, before the summer was when the summer was just starting. And so that was big news, and of course it was national, international news. And so the word started to get out about Mississippi immediately before the summer even started, before we started organizing. So part of my job was to actually write letters back to my folks, to write letters back to my relatives, ask my dad to copy the letter and send it out to a whole list of people which I had prepared ahead of time before I left, so that there was this process. And we were all asked to do the same thing. So that was the big picture, all right? So we got to Meridian. They assigned me to work on voter registration and political organizing. So there was the Freedom Schools, people who had experience teaching, educators were involved in the Freedom Schools with young African-American people. And then the community center there weren't that many throughout the South, but there was one in Meridian that the Schwerners, Mickey and Rita Schwerner had started, with library and all kinds of arts and crafts and places where young African American folks could come and hang out, or actually library where there would be books there that wouldn't be in the black library or in the libraries in the local schools about culture, art, language, African American history, stuff like that. But I didn't get involved in the Freedom Schools. So my job was to go. Primarily that summer we were organizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The plan was to organize that party throughout the summer and go to the Democratic National Convention with a contingent of black and white folks from Mississippi to challenge the all-white delegation in Mississippi, which was black people were not allowed to participate in the Democratic Party. So that meant we would go door to door. Usually we'd go in integrated couples, so me and a black person, a young man or young woman, would go to knock on doors on the streets up and down the streets of Meridian, asking people if they wanted to become part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And it was a simple form, name, address, just like kind of how we register here in Minnesota. And we kept that very confidential. That wasn't going to go anywhere. We could assure them that they weren't going to be harassed because they signed up, although I'm sure some people didn't sign up because they were afraid. And that actually went pretty well. But then if we found somebody who was really interested in political process, interested in voting, interested in getting more involved, we would ask them if they would register at the courthouse, So then we'd pull out, we'd always be carrying around these 4-page legal forms that they would have to complete to register to vote at the courthouse. And we would start to go through those with them. And sometimes it would be, if they wanted to do that, sometimes it would be more than one visit. It would be 2 or 3 visits to actually go back and continue to go over that form with people if they wanted to. Many people really didn't want to register to vote at the courthouse because it was so risky. When they'd publish your name in the paper for 2 weeks, that would give your boss or the community an opportunity to harass you, lose your job, get harassed at work, or your house get bombed, or people run by your house, the Klan intimidating you, calling you up. So it was pretty hard, but I think the Freedom Democratic Party organizing went really well. People were really into it. And then we started to hold kind of classes in political organizing, like what does it mean to vote? What does it mean to have a representative government, which isn't something black folks in Mississippi were taught in school. So the whole idea of representative government, and we had a nice booklet that we used. One of my favorite, The Power of Your Vote. It's kind of breaking the chains with the vote, and inside of it is a kind of a comic strip type thing that the way you get your vote, your voice is to vote, and it talks about getting behind the wheel of a car, and that the person that you elect with your vote drives the car, and the car is your community. So like very basic kind of pictures and images that we would use these booklets to try to help people understand why it was important to vote. I mean, we would go in and basically ask them, start out by saying what's the biggest problem in your community? You know, what would you like to have changed? And so a lot of times we hear, well, we want jobs for young people. We'd like to get our streets paved. We'd like to get some sewer here. You know, it smells. Some of the sewers aren't working. And, you know, just stuff in their community. And we'd say, do you know who makes the decisions about that? I'd say, well, that's the people that get elected at the county courthouse that make those decisions, or at the city hall. Do you know how they get put up there? No. So then we talk about elections and representative government. So we kind of use what they were interested in their community, affecting their family, and talk about how that could change by them voting and them getting involved in the political process. So as I said, as we did that door to door, actually because I was from the country, I was often assigned to go and work in the countryside rather than in the city, which was fine with me because I always feel better in the country anyway. So, you know, and a lot of the folks that came down were from cities and, you know, places they didn't entirely feel comfortable going in the country. So I was fine, you know. So I would do a lot of rural work, you know, which was great, you know. But it was also more dangerous because if you were out registering people to vote, you're an integrated couple, you go into a house, white folks drive by, they immediately know who you are. And you never know whether the Klan is going to come after you, you know. And I can tell you stories about what we had to do to avoid danger, you know, but it was pretty dangerous sometimes.
Because you're more comfortable in rural areas, do you think that really helped show that to those other people, the people you approached in these rural areas, and to kind of show, look, I'm familiar with this type of lifestyle, so it really helped them to almost trust you because you were also from a rural area?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I would talk to, you know, you go to somebody's house, what are you talking to them about? Oh, what kind of farming do you have? What kind of crops do you have? What do you grow? What kind of tractors do you have? You know, I mean, I was able to communicate about farming with people who lived in the rural areas and who farmed, you know, sharecroppers. And, you know, I learned about cotton. I never knew anything about cotton, but I learned real quick about how you grow cotton and different things, you know, how much you pick in a bale and how much you could pick in a day and how much you could work. So, you know, I just learned that kind of stuff, and so then I would be able to converse with people about things that they were dealing with every day, and that was easy for me, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it made them feel more comfortable with me. You always got to establish some comfort with folks.
Oh, absolutely, and sometimes that's the best way to get to build that trust, especially when there's this fear of.
Yeah.
So when you first arrived in Meridian, you met some of the local leaders. How did your interactions with them influence you?
It was kind of tenuous at first. I mean, first of all, in Freedom Summer, we all were assigned to live with somebody in the community. I mean, there was actually a Freedom House, which is where some civil rights workers lived together, but most of us, I lived in a Freedom House for a while, but most of us in the beginning lived in somebody's house. So you immediately began to have a connection with, you know, a black person in the community. You were living in their house. You met their kids. And I mean, this was real brave because people working in jobs, if the White Citizens Council found out that your white employer, they had a black person who put in a civil rights worker, they could lose their job just like that, you know. So it was real brave. I mean, we had around 50 people, I think, in Meridian that summer, and that means that there was 40 or 50 homes that, you know, black people opened their homes to us. And it was a little tenuous at first, but I think I began to get really comfortable with people just because I lived with this woman, Mrs. Kroll. She was a maid, and she lived alone, and she had a small little house, and she had a little extra room that she gave to me to stay in. And so I got to know her really well. It turns out she was turned out to be one of the major leaders of Meridian, the local, you know, civil rights, you know, project. It was a little tenuous at first, but it soon, I think, became comfortable. People really appreciated, you know, that we were there and that we were going to help them, you know, move on and get freedom and justice, and that was the plan, and we talked about it a lot, and they taught us about, singing freedom songs while we were in training, so you could sing freedom songs with people, which were, kind of came out of a lot of the Negro spirituals, so they were songs which people sang in their churches anyway. Part of what I actually learned a lot of is the courage that black people had in Meridian to be able to take us in, to work in the movement. And then I would hear stories, for instance, one person in Meridian, civil rights worker, learned that the family she was living with was threatened with a bomb if she didn't move out, if they didn't put her out. And so the civil rights worker assumed that she would have to find another place to stay, and she started talking about it the day that this news came down, this information came down, that this threat had come. When she went back to her family where she lived and told them that she was ready to move out, they said, "What are you talking about? Where are you going?" And she said, "Well, there was this threat, I want to get out of your house. I don't want your house to be bombed." And they said, "No, you stay here. We're not. You stay here in the community. We're going to be here. You're going to be here. We're going to all work together on this." I mean, that was like courage, Local black people were just so courageous, and that's how that's what I learned about courage. They were afraid. There wasn't any doubt about that. I was afraid. This woman was afraid who was in the house, whose house might get bombed. But as we learn, courage is about being afraid and overcoming that fear and going on and doing your work anyway. I learned that from folks there in Meridian. I learned what real courage was about. And so that was just one example. I stayed for a while in a freedom house, and the Klan came by one day and just, blasted out the front windows of the house with a shotgun, and I was sleeping on the floor, and the glass, came all over us on the floor, and shards of glass were flying everywhere. And so what we didn't know is, were they going to come back? You can say these blasts came by and they drove off. You can hear the truck taking off, and then you didn't know whether you could even move because, they might come back and break in or something, So it was like you were on your edge all the time, It was safer if you were in the black section of Meridian. There's a black part of the community. If you were there, you were usually pretty safe because, white folks didn't come into that part of town. And I think the other thing that isn't talked about a lot is that there were a lot of black people with guns who were taking care of us, who were protecting us. I didn't know that at the time because it's a nonviolent movement, and we were all nonviolent in terms of our tactics. But the black community took care of business. They had their guns, and the Klan knew they had their guns, and they didn't come into the black community very often. So it was safer there. It was kind of a sanctuary.
I know you had a very long relationship, at least at the time, with George Smith. Can you talk a little bit about how you and George met, and how your friendship grew during your time in Meridian?
I met George when I first came to Meridian. He and I were the same age. We were 21, and almost to the day. And he was just one of the local people who had helped Mickey and Rita Schwerner set up the project that had been set up in early part of '64. And his job was to find homes for all of us before Freedom Summer started. So that was his job. So he was really well liked, well known. He was actually a high school friend of James Chaney, who was murdered, and one of the 3 civil rights workers. So George and I didn't really connect a lot in the summer because there was so many people, But we got to know each other a little bit, and he was one of the leaders that would talk to us about how you approach people and where to go. He would be the one to decide, who was going to go what place to canvass, and he knew the community, and he knew, the best person to work with me or the best person from the community to work with the other civil rights worker. He would be doing those kind of things. He wasn't the director in the summer, but he became the director in the fall of '64. And George is an example of what happens if people, do civil rights work. He, first of all, lost his job as an orderly in the hospital. They fired him because he was doing civil rights work. Then he and his wife, they had 2 children, 2 small children. They got kicked out of their apartment, so they had to go live with his folks. And then before actually he was kicked out of his apartment, he had this KKK cross burned in front of his house, So they were really after him because they knew that he was one of the leaders of the movement locally. And his mother and father were both also very big leaders in the movement. The whole family was real active, you know. And I got to know him really well later on, but he and I have been friends ever since. I mean, he actually just passed away a couple of years ago, but he and I were close friends up until he died, actually, you know. Communicated quite a bit.
Talked a little bit about it, but if there's anything you want to add, we can talk about your responsibilities and activities during the summer of '64, but I think you've kind of covered a lot of that. But if you want, I mean, if there's anything that you want to add to that.
Well, we did some desegregating of lunch counters. So, you know, what that meant is that I would go in with another white person and we'd go in and order lunch. We'd kind of have the menu ahead of time so we knew what we were going to order and the black people knew what they were going to order. We'd go in and order a sandwich and a Coke or a coffee or whatever, and we'd sit there eating away, and then the two or three black people would come in and sit down at the counter and order the same thing, and they would be refused. All right, so then that would be the basis on which we did affidavits. I would do an affidavit saying that I went in there and had lunch at this particular time, and I saw these black people come in, and they ordered exactly the same thing, and they were told that they wouldn't serve them, or they would close the restaurant down. That's often what would happen. They just close the whole restaurant down, everybody would leave, and that would be the end of the business for the day because you know, they didn't want to serve black people. You know, we would do some of that, and the folks in the Freedom School were doing that too, and we desegregated probably 15 or 20 restaurants and public accommodations in the summer, in addition to doing the voter registration work. One of the things, let me just tell you about, we were doing this canvassing for voter registration in rural Lauderdale County outside of Meridian. I was with a black woman, and we were going door to door and trying to get people involved in the Freedom Democratic Party, and had some pretty good success that day. And then we were walking along the sidewalk, and we saw this pickup truck with a couple of white guys in it with Confederate flags, you know, on the you know, where the plate was, and gun rack, you know, like they have in Mississippi. They have gun racks in the back of the cab, and so we knew that was pretty much a Klan person. You can kind of identify him, you know. So we realized that we were in a small community out in the country. I mean, we're talking a small, meaning 300 or 400 people community, you know, just a little settlement. So we realized this could potentially be dangerous. So we actually went on the side of the road in the kudzu. I don't know if you've ever been to Mississippi, but this kudzu grows everywhere, up and down the power poles and up and down the side of the road. And so we jumped in the kudzu. You know, it's pretty high. And we just stayed there. Sure enough, they came back, and they had another pickup truck with more people in it, you know, driving by that street where we were, and we were hiding in the kudzu, you know. So we had to stay in there with the bugs and the worms and stuff for, I don't know, several hours till we felt like, you know, it was safe to come out, and they drove by several times. But I mean, we could have really been in trouble, you know, that day if we hadn't got out of there. So you had to use your wits sometimes, you know. And the last thing you didn't want to do is be in, you know, a black person's house, because then if the Klan came, they might hassle them. You know, so you really couldn't afford to put them in jeopardy, you know. So that's the kind of thing that happened periodically.
So these were, of course, I'm sure some of the bigger challenges you had when working, when just trying to register people to vote and all of that, just mainly with locals, and particularly local whites, right? With the
Well, actually, though, it was interesting. Black people were so afraid that a lot of times we'd go to the door and we'd hear the TV on or the radio on, and you'd see the blinds or the curtains move, but nobody would ever answer the door. I mean, that happened a lot. Or if people did answer the door, they'd look at us and realize we were civil rights workers, and they'd just close the door. They didn't want to talk with us. So that happened a lot. I mean, because just to talk with us was a risk. Just to talk with us put people in jeopardy for their job or their safety or whatever, you know. And that was just part of what you learned to accept. I mean, in the training we were told that people are going to be afraid. I mean, the other thing that was difficult for me actually was, and we were taught about this in the training, that people are going to, as you're white, they're going to call you yes sir and yes ma'am. And I wasn't comfortable with that, you know, and I would always tell people, you know, just call me Joe. My name is Joe. Just call me Joe. Okay, Mr. Joe, we'll call you Joe, Mr. Joe. So it was always Mr. and Mrs. And, and after a while you just realize, that's because people are so afraid of not doing that respectful thing with white people, that part of the culture, People that I did civil rights work with, the other movement people that were black, they'd call me by my first name, but people that didn't know me well would do that. It made me uncomfortable, but you get used to it.
Well, and so, with all of these challenges, what did you do to help local people trust you and allow you into their home, help them register to vote, even get them to sign up for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party?
As I mentioned earlier, just listening to people is always a good thing. Just listening to what they got to say about their community, what's important for them, what are the problems in their community, what's going on with their kids. Play with the kids a little bit, and just engage them socially. You don't just go in and pull your papers out and say, let's register to vote. You got to get to know them, talk to them a little bit. And that's why I'd have a black person with me, because the people's homes we were in would oftentimes connect with that local person and say, oh, well, you're so-and-so's relative, or where you live, or, I know somebody in that part of the community. Or so, the black person would be the bridge to kind of get us in the door and start talking. And my role is kind of just sit back and, kind of come forward when we were kind of getting to the paperwork, and just being respectful, and listening and asking questions. And I think asking questions and just listening to people's stories is one of the ways that I did that, and that's what we were taught to do, just listen to people and listen to what they had to say.
And you talked a little bit about this already, the approach to education for local African Americans in terms of voting rights and constitutional rights, specifically with that flyer. Was there anything else that you guys did in terms of trying to educate local African Americans about voting rights?
Well, yeah, we would have kind of political education classes. In the churches, we'd have classes where people would come together to learn more about government. We had a booklet that said County Government in Mississippi, about, a dozen pages long. And we would just use that as kind of a workbook to talk to people about voting and how they can get involved in the political party, and that they should be able to go to the Republican or Democratic Party, but they weren't allowed. And so that's why we had this alternative party. Because, the Freedom Democratic Party had precinct meetings, regional meetings, and a state convention. So part of what we had to help people understand is not just about registering to vote, but what was a political party, what was the purpose of that, and why we were forming this alternative party. And that was number one, to show that black people were interested in politics, because white folks in Mississippi would say, oh, black people don't want to vote, they're not interested in this politics, they wouldn't participate anyway, so why do you bother? And so having a parallel party that was easy for black folks to participate in showed that black people were interested, number one, showed that they were able to organize, because they got the whole thing organized all over the state by district and by precinct, right down to the local precinct. And there were thousands of people involved in the Freedom Democratic Party. They'd actually sign their name and put it down. So it was to belie the fact that black people weren't interested, but it also people learned how to organize a political party and how to run candidates. That's the other thing. We ran candidates for congressional seats, for senator. We ran people for local county offices, county supervisors. So we'd have people running for all these offices. Now, usually they wouldn't win, but just running somebody, getting the flyers together, passing them out, having people speak, and talk about their platform. That was all educational. So my job was to, help people figure out how they were going to do that. What was their strategy? Just talk it through with them, and then help them implement that. So that was kind of on the ground political education. It wasn't so much in the classroom, although we did have meetings to talk about that.
Okay. Well, you talked about this a little bit, but could you just go into a little more of the culture and race relations in regards to, more specifically, how white citizens reacted to Coll's presence in Meridian? Because you've talked a bit about how African Americans would talk to you and approach you in terms of these sorts of race relations, but how did white citizens, especially outside of the Klan, react to Coll's presence in Meridian?
In addition to the Klan, they were the shock troops, right? The people who did the bombings and the burnings and ran around with their shotguns and intimidated people. But you had the White Citizens Council, which was the business people in the South. And they were the ones that ran the community. And they were the ones that would make sure that if a local African-American person stepped out and got involved in civil rights, they would lose their job. They would go, for instance, the Citizens Council probably went to the hospital where George Smith worked and told the hospital, you better get rid of this guy or you're going to have trouble in this community if you don't get rid of him. Okay, so the White Citizens Council were the people in positions of power, bankers, elected officials, business people who actually brought down the wrath of the rest of the community and made sure that nobody stepped out of line. So it was risky for white people to step out of line in any way, because of that, because they would be targeted by the Citizens Council and the Klan as well. So whites were they didn't like us. They did, as far as we knew, they thought we should leave because that's what would be in the papers, and you hear letters to the editor about how we should leave, and they routinely call us communists and outside agitators and stuff like that, and so that was the sense that was in the community, the white community. That's who we were, and so they stayed away from us. So, I had very little contact with any white people at all. It was considered in the movement just too risky anyway, because you never knew where they were, what they stood for, how risky it would be,
I guess just a quick follow-up, just because, the White Citizens Council is pretty much the quote-unquote respectable version of the KKK, right? For the most part. So because of their essential intimidation of everyone in the community, white and black, would you say that actually led more people to vocally oppose Corps' activities in Meridian?
And it allowed people to think they were justified to harass us and to give us a hard time. I even mentioned the police. The police were just intertwined with the Klan. We had a guy, an officer in Meridian, his name was Lee Roberts. He routinely gave us tickets for stupid things like running a stop sign or making a wrong turn or stuff that we didn't make. We were very careful drivers. You drummed into you followed all the rules. One time he came up and looked at my driver's license. It was a Minnesota driver's license, and he said, I had signed it Joe Morse at the bottom of it. My name is Joseph, of course. He said, you're forging your driver's license. Come on. He drags me into the police station, for forgery. That kind of stuff, just harassment. But his brother was Alton Wayne Roberts. Alton Wayne Roberts was the Klansman who shot 2 of the 3 civil rights workers at point-blank range. So they were brothers, all right? So the Klan and the police were intertwined together. So, this guy would harass us routinely and give us tickets, and when he'd arrest us, not all of us, but some of us, including myself, we always went limp. If they were going to arrest me, they were going to have to drag me, so he'd drag me and he'd carry me and he'd throw me up against trucks, and he'd throw me up against the, walls in the police station, and, kind of clean the dust off with me when he was dragging me, and so anyway. He knew me pretty. I still actually have a ticket that he wrote to me, one of his tickets that he wrote back then in the summer of '64, So that, he was just one, but there was many officers who were intimidating us throughout the whole time,
Well, of course, that makes it very difficult for you to actually do anything and really work through all of these issues. And so, I guess just quickly, let's segue into the Pete Seeger concert at the First Union Church. Can you discuss some of your emotions, your reaction to the news when you were informed at this concert that they've discovered Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman's bodies?
Well, it wasn't a surprise to anybody that they were dead. We all knew they were dead. They'd been gone 6 weeks, and they weren't on vacation. We knew that. And I knew Fannie Lee Cheney, James's mother, and I'd been working with her, and she was really distraught. So it was shocked. We were shocked. It was just really sad to know. The worst thing, they were buried in a pond dam, under 10 feet of dirt, and that's where they were buried. It just shocked us all that that's where their bodies were found, and it was just really sadness, But nobody was really surprised, that we knew that they were dead. But I think for a lot of us, for me, it just kind of made us more determined to go on. You know, I mean, the purpose of them killing those guys was to kind of slow the movement down, intimidate us, and we were just more determined to say we're going to go on. You know, if for no other reason, in memory of the 3 civil rights workers. You know, we're going to do the job that they weren't able to do.
Well, and how did Pete Seeger deal with not only delivering the news, but then the reaction of the people at First Union?
Well, I don't remember a lot, but I just remember, I think it was toward the end of the concert that he made this announcement. I don't know. But we sang "We Shall Overcome," which is, of course, the anthem of the civil rights movement, and we joined hands and, you know, crossed hands and swayed back and forth and sang many verses of "We Shall Overcome," plus some of the other freedom songs that people liked. But people were crying and people were really sad. But I think it was really touching the way he introduced it. You know, he said, "I've got some bad news to tell us tonight, you know, and I want to let you know." But it was kind of really nice that we heard it from somebody like Pete Seeger, you know, at a concert. That we were all gathered together there. You know, it would have been worse, kind of, if we'd have heard it on the news or something, or it would have filtered out through the community when it was found. But to hear it all at the same time, this church was packed and we were all having a really good time and singing and enjoying the concert, you know. And so what better place to hear that news with your friends and your comrades all around you, you know.
Well, and not long after that, you attended Jim Chaney's memorial service. What were some of the difficulties that you and many others faced in marching with his funeral procession?
Yeah, so we decided we were going to organize marches from the 4 corners of the city to the church, which was kind of right in the middle of the city. We only had a short time to do that, less than a week, you know. But everybody, all the black people were really, you know, shocked and just upset about the whole thing that, you know, he'd been murdered and you know, so we're going to have this funeral. So it was easy to actually organize the marches and the routes. We had to pick out all the routes for people to walk, but what we were really concerned about is, because it was so public, the Klan was going to come and attack these marchers, you know. And so we were really, really freaked out about what we would do and how we were going to handle it. And the police were informed that we were going to have these marches from the 4 corners of the city to the church, and we didn't have any trouble. For whatever reason, the Klan decided they weren't going to harass us. You know, I mean, we didn't even have, you know, usually if you're having a demonstration or something, there would be, you know, white folks driving by screaming at you, you know, "End lover" or "commie" or, you know, whatever, waving the Confederate flag and all that kind of stuff. So that would be routine that you'd be having. They'd throw stuff at you sometimes. So there was a little of that, but it wasn't anything serious. Nobody got hurt. There was never any incident. Nobody like stopped their truck and got out and went into the march and beat people up, which could have happened. And it was really kind of interesting that the Klan obviously made a decision to leave us alone that night. So it was a really, really a moving service. It was just really moving to have so many people there and to be there. And I heard Dave Dennis give his famous speech about, you know, how he got really upset and angry and he wasn't supposed to. He was supposed to give a calm. Coll told him to give a calm address to the people, and you know, he lost it and just went really wild and loud, you know. But it was a real experience, you know. But it was sad. It was just a really sad thing.
Well, and that came, I believe, in roughly the middle of your time, like very early in your time down there too, right?
Oh yeah, it was August 4th when they found the bodies. Yeah. And yeah, so I think, I was looking at my flyer, we had a flyer here of that memorial service. I think it was like on the 9th or something like that. So it was fairly soon after they found the bodies, you know.
Well, and Freedom Summer was going to be over then here within, what, a month or two after?
Oh, Freedom Summer was over by the middle of August, more or less, yeah. Because people were transitioning to go to the Democratic National Convention at Atlantic City, which was, I think, 24th or something like that of August. And so it was winding down. Well, we were in the middle of it, you know, still organizing the Freedom Democratic Party convention and caucuses and stuff like that, you know.
Well, and real quick, because I know there are a few other civil rights organizations there in Meridian too. What was it like to work with other organizations? Were there any tensions between them as they're trying to all work for various goals?
The only other organization in Meridian besides Coll was the NAACP. There had been an NAACP chapter there for a long time. I don't know how long, but they were the middle-class black folk, and they really didn't want to have anything to do with this grassroots direct action movement. And so they were not helpful at all. They would not communicate with us. Some of the people who started the community center with Mickey and Rita Schwerner came out of the young NAACP, and that's how they got involved with the young NAACP. And as soon as they got involved with CORE, with the direct action movement and the freedom movement, NAACP didn't want to have anything to do with them. Because these were like middle-class blacks who had businesses, and they were respected by the white community, and they had to make their own deals and their own arrangements with the white community, and they didn't really want to be part of the riffraff like us, you know, that we're out in the streets and doing this direct action stuff and getting people registered to vote. Even though the NAACP had been getting people registered to vote for quite a while, that was one of their main things. They didn't want to have anything to do with us. And there was one person in Meridian, Charles Young. He owned a hotel right across the street from our COFO office, you know. And we used to take showers up there, you know, pay 25 cents and go in and get a shower. But he never would have anything to do with us. We felt like at times he sabotaged what work we were doing with people, talking bad about us and talking down about us within the black community. So it was pretty bad. So SNCC wasn't a presence in Meridian or in the 4th District at all. But we had dealings with them when we went to statewide events and stuff. And so SNCC was a little, I would say, more grassroots than CORE was. I mean, SNCC had been in Mississippi for like 4 years already. They've been doing organizing all over the state. They hadn't been in Meridian. They were a little bit riskier. They would take more risks, and they had people who were now civil rights workers who were from Mississippi, people that they'd trained over the last 3 or 4 years to actually be organizers. So they were much more in that way connected to the community than CORE was, because like our project director and the people that directed what we did came from other places. They weren't from Mississippi. I mean, there was two guys from New Orleans, you know, but still that's not Mississippi. You know, they were Southern blacks. But SNCC was a little edgier. I think they took more risks. They were, you know, more used to doing this grassroots organizing than I think CORE was. CORE was always into demonstrations and the freedom rides and stuff like that. But I think CORE took their lead from SNCC on this Freedom Summer, you know, because they really worked together well. I thought, as far as I know, the organizations CORE and SNCC worked really well together that summer, near as I can tell.
So now we're going to start talking about remaining in Mississippi after the summer of 1964. When did you realize that just one summer in Meridian would not be enough?
It was about mid-August 1964 when the other students were getting ready to leave, and the local people, black people, were talking about how they were concerned about the repercussions that might come down on them as a result of all the activities during Freedom Summer. I felt like it's kind of my obligation to stay if I could. So I wrote a letter to the rector of the seminary, because I was just taking the summer off and I was planning to go back to the seminary in the fall, and asked him for a leave of absence for a year so I could continue the civil rights work. And I wrote him a long letter talking about how it would make me a better priest, learning a different culture, people that were different from me, poverty. And he wrote just a one-line sentence back, said, "If you want to be a priest, you come back here in September." It was like real easy for me to say, "I'm sorry, this is more important." He didn't even respond to my concerns about why I needed to stay. So that made it kind of easy for me, because then I realized I wasn't going back to the seminary, and I felt comfortable saying, yeah, I'm just going to stay here for a while, you know. It was also because, you know, the Ku Klux Klan had a presence, and they would, you know, periodically give leaflets to us under the door of our office. Like, this is a leaflet from the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. greetings signed by the United Klans of America, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the Lauderdale County unit. Just a piece, a hate piece, and talking about what they would like to do to us. I just felt like it was important to stay there and work with folks. Besides, I was starting to make friends and getting to know people better in the community, and I realized that if I were to stay, and there was only, I think, about a handful, maybe 6 or 8 people of us that stayed past the summer, I would get to know people in the community a lot better because I'd be working a lot more closely with them, and I'd have probably a lot more, learn a lot more that way. So I really was excited about staying.
Were there any specific individuals that motivated you to stay as well?
Well, yeah, I had gotten to know, I mentioned George Smith. He became the project director in the fall after the summer, and he was a local guy. And then his mother, Agnes Smith, she was just a great person, and the woman that I stayed with in her house, Mrs. Catherine Crowell, she was just, they were both great leaders. And then there was this man, A.C. Henderson. He was actually George Smith's uncle. But I mean, he was just great because he would always take people to the courthouse. I mean, like if I would find somebody that wanted to actually go and register to vote, I wouldn't take that person to the courthouse, but AC was always ready to go. He was an independent contractor. He was a plasterer, so he didn't, the White Citizens Council couldn't really get to him because he was a skilled craftsperson, and he had many jobs and contracts, and he didn't have trouble getting work. So he was not to be intimidated, and he would just go pick people up and take them to the courthouse routinely, Found somebody that really wanted to register to vote, wanted to go down, I'd just call up AC, and he'd make the arrangements, take the person there. And so there was people like that I was starting to really get to know, that I was really, wanted to, get to know better. And then there was families of people who just really did a lot, like the Smith family and their relatives, ministers, and people who, and Roscoe Jones, I mean, he was like really an important person. He was head of the Mississippi Student Union, which was the union of students that were in the freedom schools. And Roscoe Jones was from Meridian. He was also a friend of James Chaney's, and he was a high school student, but he was actually in the office when the call came in that these 3 civil rights workers were missing on June 21st. And Sue Brown, another 18-year-old black woman she ran the office. I mean, she was the one that was taking the calls and making the calls to the FBI and the jails in the area when those 3 civil rights workers were gone. So these were some really dynamic and smart and brave people, and it just was fun to work with them.
Because you're still motivated to stay and continue the struggle, how did any of the tactics that civil rights activists used in Meridian change after the summer of 1964? And really, in Mississippi as a whole, what are some of the tactics that you will use after Freedom Summer?
Things slowed down a lot because there weren't as many organizers there, so things got down to a much more southern pace, which is slow, and we did what we could. But I think what happened after the summer was that the emphasis was more on talking to the local community about what they wanted and what direction they would like to see the movement in their community go. And for instance, one of the things that people in Meridian really wanted was jobs for the young people. Young black people were not being hired. And so that was an emphasis that we started talking about fairly soon after Freedom Summer. And then the farmers in the rural areas wanted to know more about the federal programs that were available to them that they didn't know anything about because the white, governmental, folks never shared that information. So again, with my farm background, I was able to learn about these federal programs that were available and go talk to farmers about it. It broadened out beyond just voter registration in the Freedom Democratic Party. We still did that, and actually we changed the name of our project to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party office, after the summer. It wasn't COFO anymore. And I got to know people really well, but, one of the things that happened, I guess I came to realize that even though I was doing civil rights work, and even though I was doing a lot of the black community appreciated what I was doing, there was still, an undercurrent of, you're white, and you have privilege. And there was this one guy, his name was Sam Freedom Brown. He gave him his middle name Freedom. His name was Sam Brown, but he was kind of street guy. I mean, he was like not educated, pretty illiterate, but he would really know how to sing. He was a great singer with freedom songs, and he would lead marches, and he would do desegregation, and he was just always right out there. But he drank a bit, you know. And so we were in the office, myself and, you know, 4 or 5 other people, and he came in one evening, we were hanging out, and he was drunk. He was really drunk. People used to drink what they call pot liquor, which is, you know, the poot liquor that they made in stills, you know, in Mississippi. And it was pretty bad stuff, you know, but he had been drinking some of that. You could smell it. And he got really pissed at me. He said, you know, you white so-and-so, who the hell do you think you are? You can be down here doing all this civil rights work, and you know what, we have to go through here. We have to be here, and we have to deal with all these white folks. And, you know, and he got really pissed, and he actually took a pop bottle, a Coke bottle, and he broke it against the brick wall. So he had this shard of a Coke bottle, and he was waving it around at me, swearing and cursing at me, you know. Like, that was one of the most scariest things that happened to me in the civil rights movement. This guy, he was really out of control, and he was really mad, and he and I got along great. I mean, normally, you know, but it just showed that there was a whole undercurrent of anger and hostility. And what I realized later, I mean, not at that moment, but he was able to express his hostility and his anger toward a white person, me, and he knew that he wouldn't pay a price for that. And he couldn't do that with anybody else in Meridian, any other white person in Meridian, you know. So in some ways I thought about it, it was an honor that he was able to be honest with me and tell me exactly how he was feeling, you know, but it was really scary. And the other folks in the office kind of diffused the thing, you know, took care of freedom, you know, but talked them down out of it. But.
Well, and that's almost kind of therapeutic for him too, because with that restraint and not being able to do anything about his situation for decades, and just, you know, and unfortunately, you know, essentially, unfortunately, it was just you taking the brunt of it. But at the same time, it's almost fortunate that you would take the brunt of that.
Yeah. Later on, afterward, I just realized he was being honest with me, you know. And sometimes, a lot of times, I don't think black people are honest with white people just because they can't trust how they're going to react. So some of the other things that we were different is that we started organizing in neighboring counties like Kemper County, north of Lauderdale, north of Meridian, and Neshoba County. Started going to Neshoba, and also Clark County, which is in the south, doing different marches and stuff in these different counties when they wanted to have activities and freedom days. That's when you get a bunch of people and go down to the courthouse to register to vote, and different activities throughout the region, not so much just in Meridian. So that was more interesting too. I got to know people from around the area, around the whole eastern part of Mississippi. And I guess I still was doing voter registration work. I mentioned one incident that was really terrifying also. Myself and a guy named Isaiah Thigpen, he was, again, kind of a street guy, but he was really a good civil rights worker. He and I were doing voter registration up in Kemper County, and they called it Bloody Kemper. It was so dangerous that there hadn't been much civil rights work done, and there were a lot of people, black people, had gotten killed up there. That's why they called it Bloody Kemper. And so we were going, we was in a rural area, and I don't know, you know, on the plantations there was these sharecropper houses alongside the fields, you know, maybe 20, 30 of them, you know, these kind of shacks where people would live and work in the fields. So our tactic was I would drive up and let Isaiah off, and he would kind of walk a few hundred feet to the first house and, you know, kind of check out and see whether people were interested in talking with us about voter registration, and I would just wait, you know, by the road. And so he got out, walked in, and was starting to talk to people. And so this guy came up in his pickup, white guy, with 2 guns in the rack, said, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm just turning around." He said, he went and looked at the back of my car, and he saw that it was a out-of-state tag. He said, "You're one of those damn freedom riders, aren't you?" I said, "Well, I'm just turning around here." And he said, "You better get off my damn property. I'm going to shoot your damn head off." And he went up and he reached for his double-barreled shotgun, and he put it down in front of my face through the window, you know. I just drove on out of there as fast as I could, But here was Isaiah with the folks down, along the field, So I couldn't leave him there. So I kind of drove off and then kind of doubled back, and the guy was still sitting there with his pickup. So I went back, and it was about 45 minutes before he left. This guy left in the pickup. So then I, drove back real slow along the road, and Isaiah saw me. He comes running out and got in the car, and we got out of there and went back to Meridian. So, but that was very terrifying, But this guy had actually followed us once before. We realized that there was a guy named Howard Gully. And I actually wrote a letter to the Justice Department about that to show that we were being intimidated while we were trying to register people to vote, black people to vote. We were being intimidated by local people, white people. So that was like an affidavit I sent in. I never heard much about it, but that was quite an incident.
And did you have any other types of projects that you were involved in after Freedom Summer, aside from voter registration, some of these?
Well, we continued to do desegregation, and like I said, the people in Meridian wanted their young people to have jobs. They decided that we should, this was in 1965 actually, they decided the young people should get jobs in this one Winn-Dixie store, because it was where like 95% of their customers were black people, and it was right next to the black community. And there were 2 other Winn-Dixie stores in town, but they were mostly white customer base. We got this committee together, a community committee together, who were going to be in charge of kind of running this boycott. We decided we were going to put a boycott on this store because it was mostly black people shop there, and we thought we could get them to not shop there so that young black people could get jobs. The committee actually got 15 or 20 young people and trained them how to be carry out groceries and how to do cash register work and how to stock shelves in the grocery store. So actually they did some training with the young people so that they would have applicants who would be able to do this job. And so then they asked, they got these young people to go down and apply for jobs. Of course, they wouldn't accept their applications. This community committee decided, okay, we're going to ask people to stop shopping there, They put out a flyer. This is a flyer that was made up. Many of our young Negro people have applied for jobs as checkout clerks and for carry-out groceries, but were not hired at Winn-Dixie stores. Starting November 1st, don't buy at any of the 4 Winn-Dixie stores until you see many Negro checkout and carry-out workers. Why should we spend our money where we don't have jobs? So we spread this flyer all over the community. Within a week or so, it was like 50% of their business was gone, and they were hauling groceries out the back door, truckloads of bread and meat and produce and stuff. And we found out earlier that grocery stores operate on about a 5% margin, so we knew they were losing money hand over foot. And so we would picket this grocery store regularly. Every day we'd have a picket line going around the parking lot, of this grocery store. And one Saturday, it was about middle of November, the Klan showed up in their robes, and they had signs that said, "Communists go home," "Agitators, we don't need you," "Support Winn-Dixie." And the police kind of freaked out because they thought there would be a riot. So what they did is the police said, we all had free speech to march and picket on the sidewalk, right? So they had a Klansman and a civil rights worker and a Klansman and a civil rights worker alternating. We had to stay 5 feet apart. And so we picketed like that all day, and then some people took pictures of that, of the Klan and the civil rights workers picketing. And we took those pictures and we put them all over town. Not only did black people quit going there, white people quit going there because they were freaked out. They didn't want to be in a place that might be a riot, They hired all 15 people that had applied. They got jobs. And that was the kind of victory that the community decided that's what they wanted to do. They had set up their own committee to set this up, and they were successful. And so that was the kind of thing that we did in 1965, one of the big projects for Meridian. And every community in Mississippi was doing kind of the same thing. Whatever their project was that they liked, they would organize it that way. And it was real successful.
From the sounds of it, really not much changed in terms of race relations in local politics. It sounds like at least a lot of it stayed fairly...
No, actually the KKK, they were kind of emboldened more after Freedom Summer because I think they realized that they could maybe pick us off. I mean, I think that's why they picked off James Chaney and Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, because actually we were a core project, and I think they figured that we were less experienced and less organized in Mississippi and less knowledgeable than SNCC, for instance, who ran the other congressional districts. I think the Klan, after Freedom Summer, thought they had more opportunity to maybe intimidate us, and so they did. I mean, they would put blocks of wood with a spike underneath our car tires, like while we were parked, you know, so every time you went to get in your car, you'd have to check all the wheels, and I had a pile of these things in the trunk of the car, you know what I mean, because that's what they would do all the time. I mean, they would throw rocks through the back of the car when you were driving through the street. I remember one time they just threw a rock and split out the whole back of the car, you know. So there was more intimidation like that than there was during Freedom Summer. Because part of the thing that happened was after those 3 civil rights workers got killed, the FBI was just crawling all over Meridian to try and find the murderers. And the Klan, of course, knew that because they got informed by the police. And so it was actually a safer place for a while there in Meridian because of the FBI's presence, you know. Not that they ever did anything to protect us, but just their presence, I think, intimidated the Klan.
To where they felt that there's enough federal presence here, maybe we shouldn't do something, but as soon as the FBI leaves, we have control once again.
Right, that's the way it felt, you know.
And so do you think maybe that factored also into them not breaking up Chaney's memorial service and those marches into the church?
Oh, I'm sure that's probably, I didn't think about that, but I'm sure that had something to do with it as to why they didn't, the Klan didn't harass the marchers, because there was so many FBI around that summer in August looking for those bodies and investigating the murders and trying to figure out who was responsible and all.
Let's talk a little bit about your interactions with other civil rights workers. Did you continue to get along with them, or did that relationship at least somewhat change after Freedom Summer ends, just because of the ways in which the Klan's intimidation methods intensified, and so just even harking back to when you mentioned Sam Freedom Brown, and how he reacted just in that one instance to...
Well, so I think, you know, things slowed down a little bit, and I got to know people in the local community a lot better. They got to know me, and I don't know, at the time, Coll was paying its organizers. I was actually put on staff in September of '64, but they paid us $25 every other week when they had the money, so it didn't always come. So it's like we didn't have any money, and we were all told when we came to Freedom Summer, you needed to bring along enough money for you to spend and buy your food if you wanted to eat out for the summer, you know what I mean? So I was out of money. I didn't have much money, and wasn't getting much money. So I would go to people's homes to eat routinely. I had a dozen or more people who I would just show up, you know, at dinner time, and they would feed me. You know what I mean? It wasn't, of course, anything fancy because most people were pretty poor. It helped me get to know people really well when you're hanging out in their home. And the other thing, actually, it became more fun because local people would invite me to, you know, to social gatherings. I mean, they'd invite me to parties, and they'd invite me to go out in clubs. I mean, these juke joints out in the middle of nowhere in the woods, you know. They'd invite me to go out there, and it was really great music and great dancing and just great fun, and so I was much more engaged, you know, in the social part of the community. It was like in '65, I think, that I began dating a local woman there, Maddie April. We dated, and so because I was dating her, I got to know her friends, and I got invited to go places with her friends and her family, and so I really became much more a part of the community. And I think the fact that I was dating a local black woman, I think the community felt like, oh, this guy is serious about, maybe he likes us. He's actually going to go out with one of our local girls, you know. So I think that probably helped a lot too in terms of them feeling comfortable with me, you know.
May I ask, did you eventually marry her?
Yeah, Maddie and I got married. I was in Mississippi after I was there. I was working for Coll through 1966, and then I worked for a year as an organizer for the Child Development Group of Mississippi, a Head Start program in Kemper County. So she and I were living together part of that time. And then we decided we wanted to get married. But at that time, you know, Mississippi laws would not allow integrated marriages. We chose to, you know, leave when I was finished with that Child Development Group job, went to Chicago to get married and lived there in Chicago.
Just stepping back a little bit, how did your relationship with Maddie affect your organizing and your connections with the community? I mean, I know you already said that there were at least some benefits to that with being invited to different parties, being, you know, becoming really more a part of the community, people seeing you as someone who is invested in it. But how did that affect your organizing, if at all, especially if and when local whites found out about your relationship with her?
Yeah, I don't know if whites knew about it. You know, I mean, one of the things that we couldn't do as a couple was kind of just go driving somewhere together because it was unsafe for a black and a white person to ride in a car together. The Klan would assume that you were, unless the black person was driving and the white person was in the back, or if we were but if we were together in the front seat, it would be dangerous. We were really limited to interacting and engaging ourselves in the black community. But it was nothing but good for me to be in a relationship with her. You know, it solidified, you know, like you said, my connection with the community, and people respected that. And I got to know more people just through her family and relatives and stuff, you know. More people to organize and more people to talk to, you know.
You've already talked about the Winn-Dixie boycott, but I know you were a participant in the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights. Can you talk a little bit about that?
My job was to organize the local people and not to do the out front stuff. So I mentioned Roscoe Jones. He would have been about 19 at that time. He actually somehow got himself among the 300 people that were allowed to march the whole distance from Selma to Montgomery, because there was a federal injunction that allowed the march to continue, but they only allowed 300 people. So that wasn't very many. So he got himself into that, but what I did is I helped him get over to Selma, and he figured out a way to get himself into that march. And so he marched the whole way, Roscoe did. But then what I was doing was helping people in Meridian think about, did they want to participate on the last day? Because as many people as wanted to could come on the last day as the march went into Montgomery. So we had 2 carloads of people that I helped organize and get planned to go. And then I went too, actually, on that last day to Montgomery. When I was driving people back from Montgomery to Selma after the march, and I saw the car on the side of the road that was Viola Liuzzo's car, where she was killed by the Klan that night. And, you know, she was a white woman from Detroit, and she was also chauffeuring people back and forth, and the Klan actually came up and shot through a window and killed her. But I saw a car on the side of the road. I didn't know at the time what it was. I just saw this car kind of off the road, and as I was driving the other way. But that was really scary, because the march was, you know, well protected by the National Guard, but afterward it was like the Klan was all over the place, you know, trying to stir up trouble. So that was really, really exciting to be part of that march, to be part of it with people from, you know, the community that I was working in.
Discuss a little bit about the influence of music, singing, and protest songs in the civil rights movement, particularly as it was carried out through Mississippi. I
mentioned that we learned freedom songs when we were in the training. Freedom songs were sung in the office, at mass meetings, during marches, during demonstrations. It was a way that I think we bonded together. It was actually a way that the singing together made you feel part of a movement. It made you feel less afraid for whatever reason. It was also a way to motivate people to participate and do things that they might not have already done, because you'd be singing these freedom songs at the mass meeting, and then there'd be an activity, a planned march, or, you know, voter registration the next day, and people would all be charged up, you know, and they would be agreeing that they would go to the courthouse in the song. And so they were just really important ways of organizing people, but also just making people feel, you know, solidarity with each other. and making us sane. I mean, sometimes the only thing you could do when you're scared and you were anxious and you didn't know what to do was just start singing songs. And it really helped bring people back to their roots, their core, and their values, you know. I could sing a brief song if you wanted me to.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The song that I like to sing is it's kind of the anthem of the Freedom Summer. So it wasn't one that we sang in protest lines or marches. It was more like you'd sing it in the office when you were just hanging out together. You know, it was a kind of a quiet song. So it goes like this. We've been buked and we've been scorned. We've been talked about sure as you're born. But we'll never turn back. No, we'll never turn back until we've all been freed and we have equality. We have walked through the shadows of death. We've had to walk all by ourselves. We have hung our head and cried for all those likely who died. Died for you, and he died for me. Died for the cause of equality. There's a few more verses, but those are the meaningful ones for me. And talked about Herbert Lee, you know, was one of the people that was shot dead by, I think it was a Mississippi State Legislature in McComb, Mississippi, early 60s. So singing was like really important. It just forged our discipline too, you know. If you agreed in the song, you're going to march, well then you had to march, right? Because you said it in the song, you aren't afraid of marching, you aren't afraid of the jails, you aren't afraid of the Klan, you're not afraid of the KKK. Well, if you sang it in the song, then, well, you had to do it, you know. So there you go. Singing was really important. I guess I've been involved in a lot of organizing over the years since then, and I never have felt that the movements that I've been part of had the singing like the Civil Rights Movement did, and it was one of the reasons that that movement was really successful.
Well, and I'm wondering too that if some of the reason that music, singing, and these protest songs were so important to the civil rights movement was because you had so many black local leaders, and because of the long tradition of music within these society, you know, these African American communities that have been built up well before the end of the Civil War, and how important song was to them even. As they're coming over, it's part of the essentially the African roots of where people came from and ended up in the South. So I'm wondering if that has a lot to do with it too, and maybe also helping encourage even local African Americans to join the movement because of at least some of this stuff.
Well, you know, a lot of the freedom songs came out of the black church, songs that were just same music, just different lyrics that were added to, you know, songs that people were already singing in their churches. So you're right. I mean, music was a big thing. But the other thing that I did, I like to sing. I mean, I was in a choir in high school and college, and so I would harmonize with, I mean, that was the thing that people would do, you know, they would be singing these songs, and then there would be harmonies would be going on, you know. People would just take off on a different tone, you know. So I got into that too, and that's what people really liked. They would say, "Oh, pretty good harmonizing there, Joe," you know, and they really appreciated that I would do that, you know, and that kind of endeared me to them also, you know.
Well, and on that note then too, can you talk about the role of religion or even religious faith and how it accompanied the civil rights movement overall in Mississippi during your time there?
Well, all over the South. I mean, first of all, the black church is the main primary institution in the black community, and goes way back to slavery. That was the only place that black people could be alone and by themselves without the overseers, and the white people would be in their church. That was a safe place, and so the only places in the black community that black people controlled were the churches. I mean, there wasn't any public buildings, there weren't any community centers. So the only place you could meet was in the church. And so that meant that the churches were really important. But also, I mean, there's just this long tradition of, you know, black people being in the Baptist church and the African Methodist Episcopal church. And I mean, the first thing when people would meet each other would say, "What church you go to?" It's like, you know. And so I went to the black Catholic church. There was a white and a black Catholic church in Meridian. So I went to the black Catholic church, being a Catholic and being a seminarian. So they appreciated that I was going to their church and I was singing in the choir in that church. And I mean, without the black churches, you couldn't do anything really. But that was good, and that was a place to meet. But people were afraid of their churches. They're afraid of getting them burned and bombed, you know. So a lot of the more conservative church people didn't want anything going on like that in their churches. So it was a very limited number of churches that we could actually use. You know, the one up in Philadelphia that got burned, that James Chaney and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were going to investigate, they burned that church because they were talking with the folks up there about having a freedom school there, you know, and that's why they decided to burn it. In addition, they were trying to lure James Chaney up there. I mean, Michael Schwerner up there because they were going to kill him. A
hit on him, maybe, like something like they issued some sort of hit or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know what it was, but they got I forget the guy's name. He was in prison at the time. Sam Bowers. He was the one that ordered the killing of Michael Schwerner, and the other two guys being with him just happened to be along, you know.
Because religion plays such an important role in the civil rights movement, is that why you were so surprised at the response that you got from St. Mary's when you said you needed to stay a little bit longer?
No, because, you know, the black church really responds to the community, whereas the white church just doesn't, you know. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was at that point that I kind of just pulled away from the Catholic Church. I realized that, I mean, even if you look at like the Selma to Montgomery March or some of the other big marches, there were high-ranking clergy who were on that march from like the Jewish faith. I think Rabbi Heschel, was on the march in Selma to Montgomery. I mean, he was like a major leader in the Jewish faith. There was no Catholic leaders that came and participated. There was Catholic priests there. There was no hierarchy. There was no place in the Catholic Church that I knew of that felt like civil rights was important. Actually, it made it a little easier for me to leave the church when I realized how little the Catholic Church cared about civil rights. I mean, for a Catholic clergy to be involved, that was the exception that kind of proved the rule that the Catholic Church was not engaged and involved.
So with some of this activism, you've already mentioned that you had some run-ins with the law in your time in Mississippi. Can you talk a little bit more about your run-ins with local law enforcement, and specifically if you ever got arrested at any point in time, and if so, what were the charges? What happened with those incidents?
I'm not exactly sure, but as near as I can tell, I was arrested 6 or 7 times. Usually they were for small misdemeanor kind of things, traffic offenses and harassment kind of stuff. I was arrested in Jackson in 1965. There was a big, massive demonstration there where they locked us all up and put us in the fairgrounds, you know, and there was that was a big demonstration, and I was arrested there. But then I spent time in the Meridian City Jail, you know, quite a few times. And then once in the county jail, one of the things they did to harass us was that they had a guy steal a record player, and then he planted it in our office, because we would take stuff in. People would donate stuff like clothing and, you know, stuff that people needed. So we took that in. It was a donation. It was sitting in our office, and the office was leased in my name and another woman's name, Sandy Watts. When they came with a warrant to get this record player, because they had a warrant and said they were looking for this record player, it was all kind of set up deal. They arrested us, Sandy and myself, for receiving stolen property. We went and had a trial and everything. We had a good lawyer, you know, that defended us from the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee. But I did get convicted of receiving stolen property, and they sentenced me to county jail. I only served 6 days. I thought it was longer than that, but I recently found out it was just 6 days and some records. The problem is that when you're a white civil rights worker in the South, the jails are segregated. So where do I go? I go with the white folks, right? And so the jailer would throw me in there and say, okay, here's one of these civil writers for you. And there's all these white guys in jail, you know. So you never know whether you're going to get beat up and whether you're going to get hassled. But fortunately, I didn't get really hurt. They said I had this end smell on me, and they gave me a bar of soap, and they said, you have to go into the shower and shower until you use up this bar of soap, and we don't want to see you out of the shower till that soap is gone. Maybe they'll get the smell off of you, you know. And so they were really intimidating, and they just told me to go in there. So I just started squeezing that soap, you know, as hard as I could, you know, and finally I got it squeezed down the drain after. I was in there about an hour, though, but I mean, showering. But I mean, you know, I didn't know whether I was going to get beat up. Actually, being in jail with white folks in the South was some of the scariest thing, because you never knew what they were going to do to you. And they all knew you're a civil rights worker, you know.
Well, and you also don't know if any of them have Klan connections, and if the Klan finds out, then how that will affect these guys. And even if local law enforcement say, well, if you take care of this guy for us, we might get you out of here a little quicker.
Yeah, that all could have happened. It happened a lot of times to a lot of people. I don't think, luckily it didn't happen to me, you know, but just by luck.
So did you have any other interactions with local law enforcement aside from the ones that you've already mentioned, with just the harassment, the intimidation?
Well, I was actually in a demonstration in Shibuda, Mississippi, which is in Clark County, just south of Meridian. There's an affidavit about it from a law student who was observing the demonstration, and we were there demonstrating for voter registration rights again. And there was this one young man, his name is John Summerall. He was a local leader in Clark County, and he was up speaking on the steps of the courthouse. The county sheriff just said, all of a sudden, you're finished. Stop talking. And John, you know, he just keep on, you know. And so they just went and grabbed him and dragged him down. And then the whole place just tore up, because the state troopers who were around and the county sheriff and the local police, they just started whacking us with billy clubs. And this affidavit said that they saw me getting beat up by this state trooper. I actually don't remember it, but yeah, so that was a state trooper that beat me up there. And I also got beat up once with this Winn-Dixie boycott. We were picketing on one of the stores that was white, and the Klan came, and there was about 3 or 4 guys, and they jumped out with sticks and stuff, and they started whacking at us and knocking us down. So I didn't get really hurt too bad, but could have. That happened periodically from time to time when you're out on the picket line, you know. But no, I don't have any other specific law enforcement experiences. I mean, I was actually the liaison with the FBI for a while for our project. We decided that it was important just to have a communication with the FBI, the local office, the local FBI guys. So they asked me to do that. So I'd go have coffee with them once in a while, you know, once a month or so. But the problem is that what we realized is that anything I would talk to him about would go right back to the police, because the FBI and the police work together. And if the police found out, you might as well tell the Klan. So I was not able to really talk with him about anything. I wasn't going to divulge any information to him about what we were doing, which is what he wanted. So it was kind of a joke for me to have coffee with him, but kept the lines of communication open.
Now that we're kind of wrapping up, can you talk about just some of the most important accomplishments that you had as an activist and a community organizer during your time in Mississippi? I
guess for me, the biggest accomplishment for me was really just getting to know and to trust local people. That was like the biggest deal. And then, of course, being part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party Challenge and organizing that whole thing in Mississippi and being part of that challenge at the National Democratic Convention in August of 1964. Those are the things I feel like were most important. And just being able to gain the trust of local people and them feeling like, because they really didn't want me to leave, you know, when I finally decided to leave. They didn't want me to leave. They wanted me to stay there, you know. In fact, when I still go back sometimes to visit, they say I should, you know, come back and live there, you know. The one about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a flame in front of the Confederate flag, mm-hmm. That's like a real famous pin, you know. People really think that's a really important pin. It is important to me too, because it kind of shows the flame in front of the Confederate flag, you know. It's like kind of putting off, you know, what the Confederate flag really stands for. And then the other one, of course, is you know, the SNCC hand, black and white hand together, which was a famous pit button. And then Freedom Ride, Core's Freedom Ride button. Those are all some of my favorite. And then I'm registered, yeah, so that's what people would wear on their hat or their cap, you know, proudly. They'd just wear those little pins, I'm registered, are you? And people would wear those all over, and it was just a badge of courage, you know, and like I'm part of the movement, you know.
And so very quickly, before we move on, can you go back to the Winn-Dixie story a little bit and talk about the African-American minister who was part of that and what that did for the boycott itself?
We had this community committee who was running the boycott. This one minister who was kind of part of the middle-class bourgeoisie black community actually went and visited the manager of the store and acted like he was kind of negotiating some kind of agreement to end the boycott. And the manager said, well, we'll hire 2 people. And so he came out, this minister got that information from the manager, and he came out to us and said that he settled the boycott and it was all over, we could go home. We said, oh, okay. When do we get to meet with the manager to talk about the jobs? He said, well, it's all taken care of. And I said, well, the committee, people on the committee said, well, no, if the manager wants to settle the boycott, he comes to the office of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and sits down with us, and we'll talk with him about when this boycott is going to end. And so that was kind of in the middle of it. So it went on for a while after that before we got those jobs. But it does show that there was effort sometimes by black professionals to undermine the movement, you know, and to settle for less, you know. But that's why it was important, and what I learned is to have a good, solid community committee that runs this thing, so that it wasn't like, that wasn't something I as a white person was going to deal with. I just, you know, go talk to this committee, you know, they're the ones that are going to run this, they're running the boycott, you know, and they were. And it was a real effective way to shut that kind of thing down.
So now we're going to transition into returning north. Can you talk a little bit about when and why you finally decided to leave the South?
You know, in 1966, there was a lot of discussion about, you know, maybe white people didn't really need to be in the Southern Civil Rights Movement anymore. And nobody in CORE or in the local project ever talked to me about that I needed to leave. But there was a lot of discussion about that within the movement. And so I started thinking about whether I should leave or not. And there was an opportunity to work for this Child Development Group of Mississippi. So I worked there for another year and lived in Meridian. But after that was over, I didn't have any more work. But the other thing was, Maddie and I were getting more and more serious about our relationship, and we couldn't get married in Mississippi. So that was kind of the final thing. We decided to move and go north so that we could get married. You know, and that was kind of the final decision about it. But I realized that the job of an organizer is to organize yourself out of a job, because if you're a good organizer, then you make the changes you need and you move on. I think some of the white civil rights workers felt like they were being booted out of the movement, but I never felt that way. And I don't think a lot of the civil rights workers felt that way. I think that was kind of more in the mainstream press, that's what happened, that the white people got booted out. But no, we did our job. We did it well. The black people were running the show. What better job of organizing could you do but just to say, I'm no longer needed? And the black community said, yeah, you need to keep organizing, but you need to go back into your white community and organize, because I can't organize the white community, and that's where the problem is. That's where the racism is. So it made sense to me.
And so when you finally returned north with Maddie, what was that like? Can you describe your journey a little bit when you went to Chicago?
Well, it was quite a relief to leave Mississippi. I mean, actually, I'd been going in and out of Mississippi to do some media stuff from time to time up to Minnesota. But every time I'd leave Mississippi and get into Memphis, Tennessee, the tension would just go out of me, you know what I mean? And every time I'd go into Mississippi, this anxiety would come up. It still does. I mean, actually, when I go to Mississippi, I still get anxious going into the state. So it was just a real relief when we moved to Chicago, and it was so much more comfortable for us to not have to worry about, getting shot at or followed or something just because we were together. There was an element of post-traumatic stress disorder, too, for a lot of people that were in the movement, and I think I was experiencing that myself in that I didn't, it was hard for me to be around white people. I didn't trust white people. It's like, my family was okay, but I didn't feel comfortable being around white people so much because I just used to, white people being dangerous. And just being anxious a lot, about what was going on around me and checking out, who was following me and, didn't trust the police and, just anxious about things that I recognized weren't real normal, that I didn't used to do when I lived in Minnesota before, or lived up in the Midwest before I went to the movement. I experienced some of that. It was kind of interesting to kind of work through that.
Well, and so after you returned north, and once you got through that probably fairly lengthy time period to readjust, when you reflected on your involvement in the movement, did you really find that your experience was transformative to you in any way?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think it was for all of us, but for sure for me. I mean, ever since I've been in the civil rights movement, I've always been organizing something in my community, whether it's the environment or stopping violence against women or farming practices or, protecting the bluffs here in Winona County. I've just always felt like I wanted to be organizing and doing something with people. I haven't ever felt comfortable not doing that, to some extent. But I think I also, learned that there's a real difference between social change and social work. Social work kind of works with people to help them get through a problem they're having, providing support for them when they're trying to get through a personal crisis or whatever crisis. Social change is about confronting the system, it's about taking risks and challenging the basis on which things are done and the values that people have. And that was good to kind of help put that into perspective, that we were doing social change work in the civil rights movement. We weren't doing social work, even though we delivered a few clothes and brought a few things to people that they needed. But the other thing that it did for me is that I've never been afraid to try anything. I mean, it's like, from what I've been through, it's like there's nothing that scares me or intimidates me or makes me anxious about being afraid. It's just like everything is a piece of cake compared to having been in the civil rights movement. So it kind of makes me a little fearless. But the other thing that I learned in the movement was that I can't really do anything individually, that you really have to work with a group, you have to work as a team, you have to work as a part of a movement. You need to help people see how what you're doing, what you're encouraging them to do is in their self-interest, and help translating what people's self-interest is into like making change. And so I learned how to do that, and I learned how to do that really well with some of the best organizers. And one of the things I didn't mention before is that Freedom Summer Project, but the whole Southern Civil Rights Movement, was organized by young 20-year-old black people. This whole movement. It wasn't organized by people with money and means. It wasn't organized by people with educations, big educations. It was organized by grassroots people who just decided they were going to do something. And so what I've learned from that is that you don't have to have a grand plan. You don't have to have really, really high, experienced people. You just need to go out and do it. And you can do a lot just by going out and, organizing and talking to people and asking them what they want to do and getting people together. And so that's what I've been doing all my life. But the other thing the civil rights movement helped me learn was that I just never trusted established politics again. Not the Democratic Party, certainly not the Republican Party, but I just don't trust established politicians at all because they screwed us over at the Democratic National Committee and Convention in August 1964. And I never forgot that, and I've seen it happen too many times since then, But the other thing, that I've been working on for many years now is that trying to get the murderers of the 3 civil rights workers charged and convicted. And, there was a mob of 20 people, and there was 19 of them were arrested by the FBI. They were prosecuted. Only 6 went to jail, and the maximum for six years. But the state of Mississippi never prosecuted any of those guys, and the evidence was all right there. And so we've been, myself and other people like George Smith, have periodically been going to Mississippi and, trying to talk to people and demonstrate and do marches and stuff to try to get, some justice for the people in Mississippi. And, they convicted one person, Edgar Ray Killen in 2005, when he was just about on his deathbed. They never prosecuted anybody else. Still, the state of Mississippi, as Martin Luther King says, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The federal government could only prosecute those that mob, members of the mob, for civil rights violations, federal civil rights violations, and so that was the maximum sentence they could get. Whereas the state of Mississippi would have to charge them with murder, and they never did.
And I wonder if in the state of Mississippi either the statute of limitations has already expired, or it hasn't, and the state just hasn't done anything about it.
No, they could have done it. As a matter of fact, one of the U.S. Court of Appeals said in their reviewing the case that there was, I don't know the words they used, but there was unrefutable evidence that these men conspired to kill these civil rights workers, and there's indisputable evidence that is available. And they said that, right in their decision. The state of Mississippi has chosen not to prosecute them. And they're all mostly dead now. I think there's only one living yet. Olin Burge was the man who owned the farm on which the pond dam was, where they were buried. He got charged initially, but then the charges against him were dropped. He was never even convicted of civil rights violation. It was on his property. He gave the mob the jar of gasoline that they burned the car with, all right? He never got charged.
So after you turned north, I know it took a little while for you to readjust and really get back into activism. It took a few years. Can you talk about how you continued your activism after Mississippi?
Yeah, I lived in Chicago and then Madison, Wisconsin. So I was involved in a community newspaper there, some organizing with unions. I moved out to Boston. I got involved in stopping nuclear power environmental organizing with the Clamshell Alliance. I was part of the biggest nonviolent direct action occupation out there in 1978. And I organized a local chapter of that against nuclear power. And then in the mid-'70s, I started working on stopping violence against women, and I've been worked on that ever since. So that's about 40 years of organizing with battered women's shelters and battered women's programs to try to prevent sexual and domestic violence. For a while, I did that as a counselor. I ran groups for men who batter after they were convicted, and now I'm helping to organize men to prevent sexual and domestic violence by working with boys and trying to change men's attitudes and behavior. So that's been a kind of a long commitment that I've had. And also environmental justice with Native American folks by Red Wing, try to prevent nuclear waste storage on the Mississippi River. That was environmental justice. And so I guess wherever I've lived, I've kind of been involved in organizing. Right now I got a pin here that's about frac sand. I'm working on the frac sand ban here in Winona County so they don't tear up our bluffs and take all the sand and haul it to Texas or Pennsylvania to do hydraulic fracturing. So working with Land Stewardship Project on that and good farming practices. So I've been organizing for a long time. I like to do it, but I've never really been paid for it much, ever. It's just, something I do as a hobby.
That's the life of an organizer, right? So would you say that these are, all of the ones that you've mentioned, that these are some of the most important community organizing projects you've been involved in since the mid-1960s, or are there a few that are a little more near and dear to your heart?
No, I think the environmental justice is just always really important, and then to me, and then trying to prevent sexual and domestic violence to women and children is also just really near and dear to my heart, because I feel like we will be able to have much better communities and much stronger leadership, and when women have an equal opportunity to participate in politics and government and business and the community. I know women who have not been able to be elected to political office right here in Minnesota because they were being battered and abused at the time and during their campaigns, and their husbands wouldn't let them actively campaign, you know. So it's like affects our whole community and who's involved and who's in our leadership. So I think it's just really important.
So as a community organizer and activist, what have been some of your most important accomplishments personally?
I think just learning to be respectful of people and being honest and living a life that's consistent with my values, you know, that living a life that is honest and is going to be consistent with what I believe, and not just in what I talk, but what I do. What's the Senator Paul Wellstone saying? It's about how you should live your life, not just the words you speak, but the actions that you take should be consistent. So that's the most important thing for me. And whether it's personal or political or community, you know. So I've learned a lot with people over the years about my, sexism, treating women more respectfully and more responsibly. I mean, that even started in Mississippi, because one of the people who was organizing in Mississippi and Meridian was Susan Brown Miller, who wrote the first big book on rape, Men, Women, and Rape. And she was in that project, and there was a lot of agitation among women in the civil rights movement about women's leadership, and men always taking credit and men getting all the spokespeople jobs. And so it was like, from there is what really interested me in being allies with women to prevent sexism and violence.